Thank you, Program Director. Thank you, Net, for making me a star, I believe. And hopefully we don't end up dancing people to tea. Let's keep to time, okay? So thank you to Kagiso Trust for organizing this event. If we think about where we are 2 weeks before elections, it's such an important time to just step back and reflect and think about the priorities going forward. I had a lot of debate with myself about how to approach what I would say today. Do I talk about some projects that Zenex has been involved in? Do I talk about some of the evaluations and the evidence that's been built up? And I thought, no, let me rather think about from that evidence, from the experience, and from working with so many partners who are in the room, let me share what we think should be the strategic focus areas that should lead us into the next administration. So that's the what. And then focus a little bit on the how, okay? And the theme is how can we engage more in stakeholder collaboration. So that's what I'm going to do today. Focus a little bit on the strategic areas that we think need to be addressed, and then secondly, focus on the how. Just 2 introductory remarks. Where does an organization like Zenex Foundation fit in? And I want to say there's such a range of stakeholders here, from government, from NGO, from business, civil society. Where organizations like Zenex fit in is in philanthropy. So I'm going to talk with that perspective of philanthropy, sometimes called funders, sometimes called donors, sometimes called grant makers, and looking at philanthropy as a stakeholder and how can we add value and contribute. The second introductory comment I want to make, at a time of election, there's always the temptation to focus on what's not working and what's wrong. And I want to just say at the outset, there's a lot that's in place already. We're not starting from ground zero. Many of us in the room have been working for many, many years in education. So let's bear that in mind. Now moving to the what. The big strategic area that we believe needs to be focused on is what we want to talk about as teaching in the classroom. There's an adage that says the quality of your education system rests on the quality of your teachers in the classroom. Okay. Focus on teaching in the classroom, but focus particularly on early learning and building the foundations of early learning. Now, Godwin, you showed us many slides of some of the issues in matric, you showed us some of the issues in grade 8 and 9, and we think about that as the backlogs that build up. You spoke to us about repetition, and globally, the research is pointing to if we have a strong foundation in the early years, we are not going to need to do so much catch-up and remediation in later years. So that's what I would like to argue. Focus on teaching in the classroom and particularly focus on the early grades. Now, when we talk about teaching in the classroom, we're talking about literacy and numeracy, and there's a body of evidence already about what works in terms of improving teaching in the classroom, from the point of how to develop training programs, from the point of the resources that are available through to how to support teachers in the classroom. But the second part, of supporting teaching in the classroom is a focus on the pipeline, and that's on initial teacher training. Because when we focus on teaching in the classroom, we're dealing with the here and now. When we focus on initial teacher training, we're dealing with the pipeline of bringing new teachers into the system. So having made the case about the classroom and foundational learning, I want to talk about the enabling environment that will make this happen. And the first is the curriculum. We have a sound curriculum with aspirational intent for early grades, but it makes an assumption. It makes an assumption that learners are coming into grade 1 with an access to quality ECD and from a home environment that enable them to have a language-rich environment with books. You can talk to any grade 1 teacher, and they'll talk about the difficulties they face in those first few months in teaching grade R. They're not able to get to the actual curriculum of grade R because they're already starting on a back foot and dealing with some of these backlogs that children bring into the classroom. So some real focus and review on the curriculum. Yes, it has aspirational intent, but can we think about a curriculum fit for purpose for our context? So the enabling environment needs a focus on curriculum. The second part of the enabling environment is resources, and it seems so obvious to say for children to learn to read, they need books in their hands. And unfortunately, with the budget constraints, we're finding that it's impacting on what we're calling learning and teaching resources that go into the classroom, and particularly children having access to books. The third, and this is one of the most contentious issues in our discourse in education at the moment, and that's the language policy. Now, we have an enabling language policy that focuses on mother tongue education, but it's not been inactive. Now, I'm one of the privileged ones. I've been fortunate in my education to have had the opportunity to learn from grade 1 to grade 12 in my mother tongue, English. 80% of children don't have that privilege. What we find is there's a focus in the foundation phase of all children learning in mother tongue, but when you get to grade 4, 80% of children who speak an African language in the country then switch to English. And that is where some of our serious problems start and the build-up of learning backlogs going forward. I actually want to compliment the education department for now beginning to tackling this head on. But it needs all of us in the room to provide some support. Support at the level of advocacy, because we know there's a confusion around the role of English and the power of English in our everyday lives, and separate learning English as a language and using mother tongue to learn in all your content areas. It's going to need all our support and ongoing advocacy, and it's going to need support with the DBE when we look at rollout, on developing of bilingual resources, on training teachers on how to do that. The fourth area of the enabling environment is to look at capacity strengthening. We know that at all levels of the system, and Desmond mentioned that, there's issues of capacity. How can we do that? We can look at technical assistance. We can look at actually encouraging new blood going into government and the bureaucracy. And this is a perfect area for private-public partnerships and secondments. And then lastly, what the enabling environment needs is a culture of accountability. not a culture of compliance. And we have to be ready to have an open and honest conversation in education about what that accountability means. So I've moved to speak about the strategic focus, and then I've looked at what creates the enabling environment, and now I want to talk a little bit on how. The call is for stakeholder collaboration. It's a construct that we all talk about. I think if I would go to anyone's strategy, whether you're in government, whether you are a funder or a philanthropic organization, whether you are an NGO, somewhere in your strategy you're going to talk about collaboration. But what does that mean in real terms? Okay. First, for philanthropy and for funders, a bit of holding the mirror to ourselves. Okay? And we need to think carefully about this notion of collaboration and do less of our own projects, to support our own agendas. And we have to be thinking about how we work more within the system with government. That's not to say there's no place for innovation. And yes, philanthropy and external funding play an important role in innovation because they have funding to take risk. But when we're thinking about innovation, we also have to be thinking about innovation with the view to going to scale. And when we're thinking about innovation, we must have evaluation behind that, because we have to build the evidence around whether that innovation can work. And I think a useful construct to think about this is if we as funders can think about, let's have 10% allocation to innovation. That's not to say close off innovation. And 90% thinking about how we can work more collaboratively with governments and more systemically. And there's many models that have started, and we're beginning to codify how this model of working systemically with government works. The one is government's got to lead. Okay. Yes, we are a strategic partner, but it has to be led by government. Strategic partners are funders, strategic partners as NGOs, but government's got to lead. It's got to be embedded within government. It can't be a project that's going to last for 3 years and then we move away. And what do we mean by embedded in government? It must be delivered together with people that work in government. To make that practical, if we were working on training teachers, we have to be involving subject advisors. We have to be involving departmental heads particularly in the foundation phase. What does embedding also mean? It means it has to be part of the budget of government going forward. Okay? It means it has to be part of the performance plans of government officials going forward. And lastly, it needs to be part of the planning and the monitoring and the evaluation of what government goes forward. So hopefully I've stimulated some thinking around what we should focus on, teaching in the classroom and creating that enabling environment for how that should happen. And secondly, how we can think about working more systemically, but also working collaboratively with government. Thank you.